Hey guys, tonight we dive into one of history's most catastrophic military campaigns, where starvation became the real enemy. Those 600,000 soldiers who marched into Russia with dreams of glory only to find themselves gnawing on leather and worse. While Hollywood shows you epic battles, the truth is Napoleon's Grande Army was defeated as much by hunger as by the Russian winter. So before you settle in, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here, and let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now grab a snack, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's dive into tonight's grim feast together. Let's be clear, nobody in 1812 woke up and said, you know what? I'd love to march 2,000 miles into hostile territory while eating moldy biscuits and horse meat. The soldiers of the Grande Army expected to eat like conquerors, not scavenge like starving animals. Napoleon's army wasn't prepared for what became history's most brutal lesson in military logistics. When 600,000 men started their march east, they carried standard campaign rations, hard biscuits called hardtack, salt pork, dried vegetables, and beans in their packs, plus whatever local supplies they could commandeer. But this wasn't going to be a standard campaign. Russia had other plans. The foundation of Napoleon's army diet was supposed to be hardtack. Those rock-hard biscuits that could survive anything, including apparently the apocalypse. Made from flour, water, and salt, hardtack was baked until it achieved the consistency of roof tiles. It could last for years without spoiling, which made it perfect for long campaigns, except when you actually had to eat it. Soldiers called it sheet iron or tooth dullers for good reason. To make it edible, you had to soak it in water, coffee, or soup for hours. Sometimes they'd grind it up with rifle butts and mix it with whatever liquid they could find. But even when properly prepared, hardtack tasted like salted cardboard with the texture of wet sand. Still, it was food, it was portable, and when you're starving, cardboard starts to look appetizing. The problem was the hardtack ran out much faster than anyone expected. Each soldier was supposed to carry a 3-day supply of hardtack, but the reality of marching through hostile territory meant they consumed it much faster than anticipated. The hard biscuits would crumble into dust inside their packs, leaving soldiers with handfuls of flour-like powder that they'd mix with dirty water to create a gray paste that barely resembled food. When supplies ran low, soldiers would ration their hardtack, breaking each biscuit into smaller and smaller pieces, hoarding crumbs like precious gems. Some developed elaborate systems for making their rations last longer, soaking tiny pieces overnight to maximize the feeling of eating something substantial. But these tricks only delayed the inevitable hunger that would consume the army. Salt pork was the army's primary protein when they had it. Chunks of pork preserved in salt brine, it was fatty, salty, and about as appetizing as you'd expect from meat that had been sitting in barrels for months. The salt preservation meant it could last, but it also meant every meal tasted like someone had dumped the Dead Sea into your mouth. Soldiers had to boil it multiple times just to make it edible, washing away layers of salt and hoping the meat underneath was still recognizable. When cooked properly, salt pork provided essential fats and proteins that kept soldiers functioning. But, properly cooked, required time, fuel, and clean water, 3 things that became increasingly rare as the campaign dragged on. When the salt pork ran out, soldiers started eyeing anything with 4 legs and a heartbeat. The preserved meat was supposed to last months, but the barrels weren't designed for the brutal conditions of a Russian campaign. The constant movement, extreme temperatures, and rough handling caused many barrels to leak or crack, allowing the brine to escape and the meat to spoil. Soldiers would find barrels filled with rotten, black meat that smelled like death, but some were so desperate they ate it anyway, risking dysentery and food poisoning for a few calories of protein. The army was supposed to live off the land, foraging and requisitioning supplies from conquered territories. This strategy, called living off the country, had worked in previous campaigns across fertile European farmlands. But Russia in 1812 wasn't fertile European farmland. It was a scorched wasteland. Russian forces implemented a brutal scorched earth policy, burning crops, destroying granaries, poisoning wells, and driving away livestock. Anything that could feed an invading army was destroyed before Napoleon's forces arrived. Villages that should have provided food were empty, smoking ruins. Fields that should have been full of grain were charred stubble. The countryside became a food desert stretching for hundreds of miles. Napoleon's quartermasters had planned to feed the army with Russian supplies, but the Russians made sure there was nothing left to find. The scorched earth policy was devastatingly effective. Russian peasants burned their own homes rather than let French soldiers use them for shelter. They poisoned their wells with dead animals and human waste, making the water undrinkable. They drove their livestock deep into the wilderness where the French couldn't find them. Grain stores that had taken years to accumulate were destroyed in minutes, leaving nothing but ash and smoke. Even wild game seemed to disappear, as if the animals themselves understood that death was marching through their territory. The few supplies that were found were often contaminated, poisoned, or trapped. Russian forces would leave behind barrels of grain mixed with poison or meat that had been deliberately spoiled with diseased animal carcasses. Napoleon's foragers learned to be extremely careful about any food they found, but hunger often overrode caution, leading to mass poisoning incidents that weakened units even further. When standard rations disappeared, soldiers got creative, and by creative, I mean desperate. They ate bark from birch trees, which provided some nutrition but tasted like chewing on a wooden fence post. They made soup from grass, weeds, and any plant that didn't immediately kill them. Leather became a delicacy. Soldiers boiled their boots, belts, and saddles for hours, creating a glutinous mess that resembled soup if you squinted and had been starving for days. The leather provided some calories and nutrients from the animal hide, but it was like trying to digest a shoe, which, technically, it was. Horse meat became the primary protein when horses started dying from cold, exhaustion, and starvation. Dead horses were butchered immediately, their meat distributed among starving soldiers who had long since abandoned any thoughts about the quality or freshness of their protein. The desperation for food led to increasingly bizarre culinary experiments. Soldiers would mix sawdust with flour to stretch their meager supplies, creating a substance that was more wood than food. They chewed on pieces of paper and cloth, hoping to extract some minimal nutrition from the fibers. Some men tried to eat their leather cartridge boxes, ammunition pouches, and even their musket slings. Any organic material became potential food, including tallow candles, which were technically edible but tasted like eating solidified grease mixed with dirt. Pine needles were boiled into tea, which provided some vitamin C but tasted like turpentine. Soldiers learned to identify which tree barks were least likely to kill them immediately, with birch and willow being the preferred choices, though neither provided much actual nutrition. The process of preparing bark for eating was time-consuming and disgusting. The outer bark had to be stripped away, leaving only the inner cambium layer, which was then scraped off, dried, and ground into a powder that could be mixed with water to create a paste that resembled food if you were extremely generous with your definition. Some soldiers became expert foragers, learning to identify edible roots, mushrooms, and berries that could supplement their non-existent rations. But foraging in a war zone was extremely dangerous, as it required leaving the relative safety of the army to search for food in areas that might be patrolled by Russian forces or contaminated with disease. Many soldiers who went out foraging never returned, either killed, captured, or simply lost in the vast Russian wilderness. But the real horror came when even the horses were gone and soldiers turned to the unthinkable. Cannibalism wasn't officially acknowledged, but French memoirs and diaries hint at its occurrence when men faced the choice between death and devouring their fallen comrades. Some soldiers began following the army's retreat specifically to scavenge corpses for meat. The frozen bodies were easier to preserve in the brutal Russian winter, creating a ghastly supply chain of human flesh. Nobody spoke about it openly, nobody recorded it in official reports, but the whispers and haunted looks told the story. Starvation had reduced Napoleon's civilized army to prehistoric survival instincts where anything organic became potential food. The cannibalism began subtly at first. Soldiers would strip the dead of their clothing and equipment, but some noticed that the frozen corpses could provide protein that might mean the difference between life and death. Small groups of soldiers would quietly disappear from camp at night, returning with mysterious packages of meat that they claimed came from horses or wild animals that nobody else had seen. The meat was always cooked thoroughly and mixed with whatever other ingredients were available to disguise its origin, but the taste and texture were unmistakably human. Some soldiers justified it by telling themselves they were only eating enemies or deserters, not their own comrades, but the distinction became meaningless when hunger drove men to desperation. Officers who discovered cannibalism faced an impossible choice. They could punish the soldiers, but that meant executing men who were already starving, or they could ignore it and maintain plausible deniability. Most chose to look the other way, understanding that moral standards were a luxury that a starving army couldn't afford. The psychological impact of cannibalism was devastating, even for soldiers who never participated directly. The knowledge that it was happening created an atmosphere of horror and paranoia where nobody could be trusted, and death became not just an escape from suffering but a potential source of food for the living. The retreat from Moscow turned into a cannibalistic nightmare as the Grande Army collapsed into a starving mob. Discipline broke down completely as soldiers abandoned formation to hunt for scraps. Imagine 100,000 desperate men competing for a single dead horse or fighting over a handful of grain found in a burned village. Officers lost control as survival instincts overrode military hierarchy. Soldiers murdered each other for bread crusts or a piece of moldy cheese. The lucky ones found frozen potatoes buried under snow. The unlucky ones ate their fallen comrades. Napoleon himself was reduced to eating the same meager rations as his men, though he was better protected from the worst of the starvation. His imperial guard maintained slightly better discipline and food access, but even they were reduced to eating horses and whatever they could scavenge from the frozen wasteland. During the retreat, the competition for food became murderous. Soldiers would kill each other over scraps that wouldn't feed a child. Groups of men would form temporary alliances to hunt for food, but these partnerships often ended in violence when something edible was actually found. The stronger soldiers took food from the weaker ones without hesitation, and the wounded were often abandoned because they couldn't contribute to the search for supplies. The army's baggage train became a target for desperate soldiers who attacked their own supply wagons, fighting off guards to get at whatever provisions remained, even if it was just animal feed or spoiled grain meant for the horses. The march back from Moscow was littered with the bodies of soldiers who had been killed not by Russians but by their own comrades in fights over food. Discipline completely collapsed as units disintegrated into small bands of men who trusted nobody and shared nothing. The concept of military order became meaningless when survival required abandoning wounded comrades and stealing from the dead. Even the officers were not immune to the violence, as desperate soldiers would attack anyone they thought might have hidden food, regardless of rank or previous loyalty. Winter warfare meant that water became as precious as food. Soldiers melted snow and ice, but this required fuel, which was often unavailable. Dehydration became as deadly as starvation as men's bodies shut down from lack of fluids. Many soldiers ate snow directly, which provided water but lowered their core body temperature, hastening death from hypothermia. Finding drinkable water that wasn't contaminated with corpses, human waste, or disease became a daily struggle. Rivers and streams were often frozen solid or polluted beyond use. Soldiers learned to collect clean snow from areas away from the army's passage, but even this became dangerous as Russian forces poisoned water sources and contaminated snow with dead animals and human remains. The water problem was made worse by the fact that melting snow or ice required fuel for fires, but wood was scarce and coal was non-existent. Soldiers would burn anything that would catch fire, including furniture torn from abandoned buildings, pieces of wagons, and even their own equipment, but fuel was always in short supply. Some units tried to conserve fuel by melting large quantities of snow at once and storing the water in containers, but the water would freeze again within hours in the brutal Russian cold, making the whole process inefficient and wasteful. Drinking contaminated water was often worse than drinking no water at all, as it led to dysentery and other diseases that weakened soldiers even further, but desperation often overrode caution. Some soldiers tried to purify water by boiling it, but this required even more fuel and didn't eliminate all contaminants. Many resorted to drinking their own urine or the urine of horses when no other liquid was available, a practice that provided minimal hydration while adding more toxins to their already weakened systems. The psychological impact of starvation was as devastating as the physical effects. Soldiers hallucinated about food, dreaming of bread, meat, and wine while gnawing on tree bark. They fought each other with knife and bayonet over scraps that wouldn't feed a rat. Men who had marched as brothers became enemies the moment food appeared. Some soldiers hoarded moldy grain or rotten meat, hiding it from their own comrades who would kill for a single bite. The constant hunger drove men mad with desperation, creating a nightmare of paranoia, violence, and betrayal where former friends became potential sources of food or competitors for survival. The mental effects of prolonged starvation created a form of temporary insanity where rational thought was replaced by an obsession with food. Soldiers would spend hours planning elaborate meals they would eat when they returned to France, describing in detail the taste and texture of foods they might never see again. Some men became convinced that their comrades were hiding food and would search through personal belongings and equipment looking for non-existent rations. The hallucinations became so vivid that soldiers would attack empty air, thinking they saw bread or meat that wasn't there. Others became catatonic, sitting motionless for hours, staring at nothing while their bodies slowly consumed themselves for energy. The psychological breakdown was made worse by the knowledge that they were part of what had once been the most powerful army in Europe. The cognitive dissonance between their past glory and current degradation created a mental trauma that many survivors carried for the rest of their lives. Medical officers documented the stages of starvation as the army deteriorated. First came constant hunger and weakness, then muscle wasting as the body consumed itself for energy. Soldiers' faces became gaunt, their eyes sunken, their movements slow and mechanical. Many developed scurvy from lack of fresh vegetables, their gums bleeding and teeth falling out. Others suffered from dysentery and typhus spread by contaminated food and water. The combination of starvation, disease, and cold created a medical catastrophe that killed more soldiers than all the battles combined. French doctors had no effective treatments for mass starvation and could only watch as otherwise healthy young men wasted away to skeletal shadows. The medical documentation from the Russian campaign provides a horrifying picture of human degradation. French surgeons recorded cases of soldiers whose bodies had consumed so much muscle mass that they could no longer walk or even stand. The skin would hang loose on skeletal frames, and many men looked like walking corpses weeks before they actually died. The lack of vitamins caused a variety of diseases, including night blindness from vitamin A deficiency and bleeding disorders from vitamin C deficiency. Some soldiers lost their hair and teeth, while others developed open sores that wouldn't heal because their bodies lacked the nutrients necessary for basic cellular repair. The doctors noted that even minor injuries became fatal because malnourished bodies couldn't fight infection or heal wounds. Napoleon's logistics system completely collapsed under the strain of feeding 600,000 men across hostile territory. The Grande Armée's supply train stretched for hundreds of miles, making it vulnerable to Russian attacks and impossible to coordinate effectively. Wagons broke down in the mud and snow, their contents scattered and lost. Supply depots that should have contained months of rations were found empty, destroyed by Russian raids, or never properly stocked in the first place. French quartermasters had planned for a quick campaign with easy access to local supplies, but found themselves trying to feed a massive army in a food desert. Communication between units broke down, meaning some regiments starved while others might have had slightly better access to supplies. The entire logistical structure that had made Napoleon's previous campaigns successful crumbled in the face of Russian geography and weather. The logistical failure was systematic and complete. The supply trains that followed the army were designed for European roads and weather, not the primitive tracks and brutal climate of Russia. Wagons that could easily travel on paved French roads broke down in the first muddy field, while others became stuck in snow drifts and had to be abandoned with their precious cargo of food scattered to the wind. The horses pulling the supply wagons died from cold and exhaustion faster than they could be replaced, leaving hundreds of loaded wagons stranded along the route. The communication system that was supposed to coordinate supply distribution failed completely as messengers were killed, captured, or simply lost in the vast Russian landscape. Units would march for days without knowing where the next supply depot was located, only to find it empty or destroyed when they finally arrived. The centralized supply system that worked so well in civilized Europe was completely inadequate for the challenges of the Russian campaign, where every mile of advance took the army further from its base of supply and deeper into hostile territory. The march to Moscow was bad, but the retreat was apocalyptic. As Napoleon's army fled westward, they competed with each other for dwindling food supplies. Soldiers abandoned their weapons to carry extra rations or cooking equipment, but soon even that was useless as there was nothing left to cook. Dead horses littered the retreat route, picked clean by desperate men who fought over bones and scraps of hide. The army left a trail of corpses across the Russian landscape, men who had simply stopped walking and died of starvation in the snow. French engineers tried to establish supply depots along the retreat route, but Russian forces destroyed them faster than they could be restocked. The retreat became a race between starvation and freezing, with most soldiers losing both battles. The retreat from Moscow was when the food situation went from desperate to apocalyptic. The army that had struggled to find adequate supplies during the advance now had to compete for non-existent food while racing against the approaching winter. Soldiers who had carefully rationed their remaining supplies now consumed everything they had in a desperate attempt to maintain the energy needed for the long march back to France. The roads became littered with discarded equipment as men threw away everything that wasn't essential for survival, but even that wasn't enough to lighten their load as their bodies weakened from hunger and exhaustion. The few supply depots that the French had established along their route of advance were quickly overwhelmed by the retreating army and emptied within hours, leaving thousands of soldiers with nothing. Units that arrived at depots even a few hours late found nothing but empty warehouses and the scattered remains of packaging materials. The competition for food became so intense that soldiers would fight pitched battles over a single loaf of bread or a handful of grain found in an abandoned building. Some soldiers developed incredible survival skills, learning to find hidden food caches or identifying edible plants that others missed. They became expert scavengers, able to smell out buried grain or locate frozen vegetables in abandoned root cellars. These men often survived when others died, but they paid a psychological price, becoming suspicious, paranoid, and aggressive in their pursuit of food. Veterans of the Russian campaign who survived never forgot the lessons of starvation. They hoarded food for the rest of their lives, and many never fully trusted that their next meal would come. Some formed small survival groups, sharing resources and protecting each other, but these alliances often broke down when food became scarce and survival instincts took over. The survivors who developed these skills often became the informal leaders of small groups, teaching others how to find food in the most unlikely places. They knew which buildings were most likely to have hidden root cellars and which types of trees had edible bark. They could identify animal tracks in the snow and follow them to possible sources of meat, even if the animal was long dead and partially decomposed. These expert foragers often survived by keeping their knowledge secret, sharing only with a trusted few and avoiding the large groups where competition for food was most intense. But the psychological cost was enormous, as these men learned to trust nobody and to see every other person as a potential threat to their survival. The skills they developed in Russia stayed with them for the rest of their lives, making it difficult for them to form normal relationships or to enjoy meals without constantly worrying about where the next one would come from. Many became lifelong hoarders, unable to throw away even spoiled food because they remembered too clearly what it felt like to have nothing. The irony was that Napoleon's army had started the campaign with some of the best field rations in military history. French military commissaries had developed sophisticated preservation techniques, portable soups, and concentrated foods that could sustain an army for months. But these supplies were calculated for a normal campaign, not a march across the Russian wilderness where resupply was impossible. The Grande Army carried enough food for perhaps 6 weeks of normal campaigning, but the Russian campaign lasted 6 months in increasingly hostile conditions. By the time they reached Moscow, most soldiers hadn't seen proper rations in weeks, and the retreat eliminated any hope of organized food distribution. The French had pioneered many innovations in military food preservation, including compressed vegetables, portable soups, and concentrated broths that could be reconstituted with hot water. These rations were nutritious, compact, and designed to provide adequate nutrition for active soldiers, but they were never intended to be the sole source of food for months at a time. The calculations for the Russian campaign assumed that local supplies would be available to supplement the rations, but the scorched earth policy eliminated this possibility entirely. The portable soups that were supposed to provide hot, nutritious meals became impossible to prepare when there was no fuel for cooking fires and no clean water for reconstitution. Soldiers were reduced to eating the concentrated soup cubes dry, which provided some nutrition but was like chewing on salty chalk. The compressed vegetables became inedible when they got wet from rain or snow and froze into solid blocks that couldn't be broken apart even with tools. The psychological warfare of starvation affected every level of the army, from private soldiers to general staff. Napoleon's marshals found themselves competing for the same scarce resources as common soldiers, though they maintained slightly better access through their personal staff and connections. Officers who had dined on fine wines and elaborate meals in Paris were reduced to gnawing on bones and fighting over scraps of bread. The social hierarchy of the army began to crumble as survival became the only priority that mattered. Some officers maintained discipline through shared suffering, but others used their rank to hoard food at the expense of their men, creating resentment and mutiny. The breakdown of the military hierarchy was particularly visible when it came to food distribution. Officers who had always eaten better than their men suddenly found themselves begging for scraps while their soldiers looked on with a mixture of satisfaction and disgust. The elaborate etiquette of military dining disappeared as survival instincts took over. Some officers tried to maintain their privileges by using their authority to requisition food from their own units, but this often backfired as hungry soldiers became increasingly unwilling to follow orders from leaders who ate while they starved. The mutinies that occurred during the retreat were often triggered not by military defeats but by disputes over food distribution. Russian winter warfare turned food into a weapon as deadly as any cannon. The brutal cold meant that any food had to be eaten quickly before it froze solid, but it also meant that preservation wasn't a problem since everything froze naturally. Soldiers learned to keep small amounts of food close to their bodies, using body heat to prevent complete freezing, but this meant carrying less food overall. The cold also increased caloric needs dramatically as bodies burned energy just trying to stay warm, meaning that even when food was available, it wasn't enough to sustain the soldiers through the brutal Russian winter. The physiological demands of winter warfare were staggering. A soldier marching in sub-zero temperatures could burn up to 6,000 calories per day just to maintain basic body functions and keep moving, but the army's rations, even when available, provided less than 2,000 calories. This deficit meant that soldiers were essentially starving themselves to death even when they had access to food. The human body began consuming muscle tissue and organs for energy, leading to a rapid physical deterioration that made men look like walking skeletons within weeks. The cold also affected digestion, making it difficult for weakened bodies to process what little food was available. Many soldiers found that even when they managed to eat something, their bodies couldn't absorb the nutrients efficiently, leading to a vicious cycle where eating became less and less effective at providing energy. The few successful foraging expeditions became legendary among the starving troops. Small groups of soldiers who managed to find hidden grain stores or livestock became heroes, sharing their discoveries with their units when possible. But these successes were rare and often came at great cost, as foraging parties faced Russian attacks, frostbite, and getting lost in the wilderness. Many soldiers who left camp to search for food never returned, either killed by Russians, frozen to death, or simply lost in the vast Russian landscape. The risk of foraging often outweighed the potential rewards, but desperation drove men to try anyway. The most successful foraging parties were usually led by soldiers who had grown up in rural areas and understood how peasants hid their food supplies. They knew to look for false walls in cellars, buried caches marked by seemingly random stones, and grain hidden in church altars or underneath floorboards. These men became invaluable to their units, but they also became targets for other desperate soldiers who would follow them and sometimes kill them for their knowledge. Some foragers developed elaborate deception techniques, leading multiple fake expeditions to throw off competitors before conducting their real searches in secret. The psychology of successful foragers was often disturbing, as they learned to think like desperate peasants hiding food from armies. They would search areas that had already been ransacked multiple times, knowing that scared civilians often had multiple hiding places and would only reveal the least important ones when threatened. Some became expert at reading the landscape, identifying the subtle signs that indicated where people might have buried supplies or hidden livestock. The knowledge they gained often came at the cost of their humanity, as they learned to exploit the desperation of civilians and to see every human interaction as a potential source of food. Field hospitals became scenes of horror as doctors tried to treat starvation without food. Medical officers documented cases of soldiers eating anything they could find, including soap, candles, and leather medical equipment. French surgeons performed amputations with soldiers who were too weak from hunger to survive the procedure. The wounded were often abandoned because the army couldn't spare food for men who couldn't march and carry their own weight. Medical supplies intended for treating battle wounds were useless against the slow death of starvation that consumed the army from within. The medical corps faced impossible decisions about resource allocation. When medicine was scarce, should it go to soldiers who could be saved or to those who were suffering the most? When food was found, should it go to the healthy soldiers who could continue fighting or to the sick who needed it most to recover? French doctors found themselves practicing a form of battlefield triage that prioritized survival over treatment, with the healthiest soldiers receiving what little medical attention was available while the wounded and sick were left to die. The psychological trauma of these decisions haunted medical personnel who had trained to save lives but found themselves forced to choose who lived and who died based on brutal calculations of utility rather than medical need. The field hospitals themselves became death traps as the concentrated population of sick and wounded attracted Russian attacks and raids. Hospitals were abandoned with alarming frequency, leaving wounded soldiers to freeze to death or be captured by Russian forces. Medical equipment was often abandoned or destroyed during these hasty evacuations, meaning that subsequent hospitals had even fewer resources to work with. The smell of death and decay around field hospitals became so overwhelming that healthy soldiers avoided them whenever possible, even when they desperately needed medical attention. Some wounded soldiers chose to continue marching rather than enter field hospitals, understanding that admission was essentially a death sentence. The medical documentation from these hospitals provides some of the most detailed accounts of mass starvation in military history. Doctors recorded the progression of starvation with clinical precision, noting how soldiers' bodies consumed muscle mass, how their skin developed a characteristic gray pallor, and how their mental faculties deteriorated as their brains were deprived of nutrients. They observed that starving soldiers often developed an obsession with food that overrode all other concerns, including their own safety and the welfare of their comrades. The medical records also document the various desperate attempts to create nutrition from non-food sources, including experiments with boiling leather, sawdust, and even human hair to create broths that might provide minimal sustenance. The survivors of Napoleon's Russian campaign never forgot the taste of desperation. Many wrote memoirs describing their experiences, but few could adequately convey the constant gnawing hunger that drove men to madness. The Grande Army that had marched into Russia as one of history's most professional military forces returned as a scattered mob of skeletal survivors who had learned that civilization was just a thin veneer over the brutal reality of survival. The campaign destroyed not just an army but the myth of Napoleon's invincibility and the belief that modern warfare could overcome the basic realities of logistics and supply. The survivors carried physical and psychological scars that marked them for life. Many developed eating disorders, either hoarding food compulsively or being unable to eat normally due to trauma associated with starvation. Some could never again enjoy meals without feeling guilty about eating when so many of their comrades had died hungry. The social bonds that had held military units together were permanently damaged, as survivors remembered who had shared food and who had hoarded it, who had helped dying comrades and who had stolen from the dead. Veterans of the Russian campaign often found it difficult to form close relationships because they had learned not to trust anyone when survival was at stake. The trauma of starvation affected entire families as survivors passed on their food anxieties to their children and grandchildren. Many veterans became obsessive gardeners, growing far more food than they could ever eat as insurance against future starvation. Some developed elaborate food storage systems in their homes, keeping months or even years' worth of supplies as a psychological buffer against the fear of hunger. The nightmares and flashbacks experienced by survivors often centered around food or the lack of it, with many veterans reporting dreams about finding bread or meat only to wake up and discover it was an illusion. When the remnants of the Grande Army finally staggered back across the Niemen River, fewer than 30,000 effective soldiers remained from the original 600,000. Most had died not in glorious battle but from starvation, disease, and cold. The few survivors carried with them the traumatic memory of what men become when reduced to fighting over scraps of moldy bread and frozen horse meat. Napoleon's Russian campaign became history's greatest lesson in the importance of military logistics and the reality that armies march on their stomachs, even when those stomachs are empty. The crossing of the Niemen River was itself a nightmare, as surviving soldiers competed for space on the few remaining bridges and ferries. Many drowned attempting to cross the icy water, while others were pushed into the river by desperate comrades trying to reach safety first. The retreat had become so disorganized that there was no longer any semblance of military order, just thousands of individual men trying to save themselves by any means necessary. Some soldiers had become so weakened by starvation that they collapsed and died within sight of the border, unable to complete the final few miles of their journey home. The irony was bitter. Men who had survived thousands of miles of marching through the worst conditions imaginable died just short of safety because their bodies finally gave out. The river crossing became a final test of survival where only the strongest and most ruthless made it across alive. The campaign's failure wasn't just military, it was culinary, proving that even the greatest army in the world could be defeated by empty plates and bare pantries. Napoleon learned too late that conquering territory means nothing if you can't feed the soldiers holding it. The Russian winter and scorched earth tactics created a perfect storm of starvation that no amount of military genius could overcome. When soldiers are reduced to eating their boots, the war is already lost. Napoleon himself later admitted that he had underestimated the logistical challenges of the Russian campaign, but this admission came too late to save the hundreds of thousands of men who died from hunger and cold. The emperor's famous quote that, "an army marches on its stomach," took on a grimly ironic meaning in the context of the Russian disaster, where stomachs remained empty for months at a time. The strategic implications of the food crisis extended far beyond the immediate military defeat, as word of the army's suffering spread throughout Europe. Other nations that had been cowed by French military might began to see Napoleon as vulnerable. The image of French soldiers reduced to cannibalism and eating leather destroyed the aura of invincibility that had been one of Napoleon's greatest strategic assets. The failure in Russia marked the beginning of the end for the French Empire, as coalition after coalition formed to take advantage of Napoleon's weakened position. European powers had learned that the Grande Army could be defeated not through superior tactics or better soldiers but through the simple expedient of denying them food. The Russian model of scorched earth warfare was studied and copied by other nations facing French invasion, leading to a fundamental shift in how wars were fought. The food crisis in Russia also had long-term effects on military science, as armies began to invest much more heavily in logistics and supply chain management. The traditional European approach to warfare, which relied on foraging and local requisitions, was permanently discredited by the Russian disaster. Future military planners would never again underestimate the importance of maintaining reliable supply lines, even at the cost of operational flexibility. The development of modern military logistics can be traced directly back to the lessons learned from Napoleon's starving army in Russia. The cultural impact of the Russian campaign extended far beyond military circles, as stories of the army's suffering became part of European folklore. The image of soldiers eating their boots and turning to cannibalism became a powerful symbol of the costs of war and the fragility of civilization. French literature of the 19th century was deeply influenced by accounts of the Russian campaign, with many writers using the experience of starvation as a metaphor for human degradation and the collapse of social order. The campaign also influenced European attitudes toward Russia, which was seen as a land of endless space and brutal conditions that could destroy even the most powerful armies. The stereotype of General Winter as Russia's greatest weapon originated with Napoleon's campaign and continued to influence military planning well into the 20th century. So the next time you complain about cafeteria food or a delayed dinner delivery, remember Napoleon's Grande Army stumbling through the Russian snow, fighting each other for crusts of bread and strips of leather. Because sometimes the most brutal battles aren't fought with swords and cannons but with empty stomachs and the desperate mathematics of survival. And in that arithmetic, Napoleon's empire learned that hunger is the one enemy that no army can defeat. The legacy of those starving soldiers echoes through history, reminding us that behind every great military disaster lies the simple human need for food and the terrible things people will do when that need is not met. But let's dig deeper into the specific foods that sustained and failed Napoleon's army, because the devil, as they say, is in the details, and those details are absolutely horrifying. The standard French military ration of 1812 was actually quite sophisticated for its time, consisting of items that had been developed through decades of military experience. Each soldier was supposed to receive daily rations of 24 ounces of bread or hardtack, 8 ounces of meat, usually beef or pork, 2 ounces of dried vegetables, 1 ounce of fat or oil, and a gill of brandy, roughly equivalent to a quarter pint. This ration provided approximately 3,000 calories per day, which was adequate for active soldiers under normal conditions. The bread ration was particularly important as it provided the bulk of the army's carbohydrates and was supposed to be baked fresh whenever possible using portable ovens that traveled with the army. However, the reality of the Russian campaign meant that fresh bread became impossible to produce, forcing the army to rely entirely on hardtack. The hardtack itself was a marvel of military engineering, designed to last indefinitely while providing maximum nutrition in minimum space. Made from flour, water, and salt, it was baked until completely dry, removing all moisture that could lead to spoilage. The biscuits were so hard that they could be used as building materials, and there are accounts of soldiers using them to repair wagon wheels and even as ammunition when other projectiles ran out. The preparation of hardtack required special techniques that many soldiers never mastered, leading to broken teeth and digestive problems when eaten improperly. Some regiments developed elaborate rituals around softening hardtack, including letting it soak overnight in whatever liquid was available or grinding it up with musket butts to create a flour that could be mixed into gruel. When properly prepared, hardtack could actually be quite nutritious, providing complex carbohydrates and some protein, but the key phrase was, properly prepared, which became increasingly impossible as the campaign progressed. The salt pork that formed the core of the army's protein ration was preserved using techniques that dated back centuries. Pork was packed in barrels with alternating layers of salt, creating an environment hostile to bacteria and other microorganisms that caused spoilage. The salt curing process drew moisture out of the meat while infusing it with enough sodium to preserve it for years if stored properly. However, the constant movement and rough handling of the Russian campaign meant that many barrels developed leaks, allowing the protective brine to escape and the meat to spoil. Some soldiers became expert at detecting spoiled salt pork by smell and texture, but others either couldn't tell the difference or were too hungry to care, leading to widespread food poisoning that further weakened the army. The preparation of salt pork required multiple washings and long cooking times to remove enough salt to make it palatable, but these requirements assumed access to clean water and fuel for cooking, both of which became increasingly scarce as the campaign progressed. Many soldiers resorted to eating salt pork raw, which provided protein but also delivered dangerous amounts of sodium that could cause dehydration and kidney problems. The dried vegetables that were supposed to supplement the basic rations included onions, carrots, turnips, and occasionally dried peas or beans. These were intended to prevent scurvy and other nutritional deficiency diseases that had plagued armies throughout history. The vegetables were prepared by slicing them thin and drying them completely, removing all moisture to prevent spoilage. Like hardtack, the dried vegetables required proper preparation to be nutritious and palatable. They needed to be soaked for hours before cooking and then boiled extensively to restore their texture and flavor. However, the dehydration process destroyed many of the vitamins that were supposed to prevent disease, making the vegetables less effective than fresh ones at maintaining soldier health. When the army ran out of fuel for cooking, the dried vegetables became nearly inedible, providing minimal nutrition while requiring enormous amounts of chewing. The fat or oil ration was critical for providing the high-calorie nutrition that soldiers needed for energy and warmth. Animal fats were preferred because they provided more calories per ounce than other foods and could be used for cooking or eaten directly. The fat was usually rendered from beef or pork and stored in containers that could survive rough handling. However, fat was also one of the first rations to be consumed completely because hungry soldiers found it impossible to save these calorie-dense foods for later use. When fat supplies ran out, soldiers began burning furniture, clothing, and even their own equipment for cooking fuel, leading to a cascade of problems that made food preparation increasingly difficult. The brandy ration served multiple purposes beyond simple morale boosting. Alcohol provided calories, helped preserve other foods when mixed with them, and served as a mild anesthetic for soldiers suffering from injuries or illness. It also provided some psychological comfort during the worst moments of the campaign, helping soldiers cope with the stress and trauma of constant hunger and cold. However, the brandy ration was often consumed immediately rather than being saved for times of greatest need, and when supplies ran out, some soldiers turned to drinking anything that contained alcohol, including medical supplies and industrial spirits that were intended for other purposes. The consumption of non-beverage alcohol led to additional health problems, including blindness and liver damage that further weakened the army. But the sophisticated ration system broke down completely within weeks of entering Russia, as the distances involved made resupply impossible and the scorched earth tactics eliminated local sources of food. Soldiers found themselves trying to survive on whatever they could carry in their packs plus anything they could find along the route of march. The foraging system that was supposed to supplement official rations became the army's primary source of food, but foraging in a devastated landscape yielded very little that was actually edible. Soldiers learned to identify edible plants that grew wild in Russia, including various berries, nuts, and root vegetables, but this knowledge came slowly and often at the cost of poisoning when soldiers ate the wrong plants. Some regiments developed informal networks for sharing information about safe foods, but communication between units was poor, and many discoveries about edible plants never spread beyond small groups of soldiers. The development of foraging skills became a matter of life and death, with some soldiers becoming expert at finding food sources that others missed. These soldiers often survived when others died, but they also became targets for robbery and violence as desperate men tried to steal their food or force them to reveal the locations of their finds. The competition for foraged food became so intense that some soldiers began working alone rather than in groups to avoid having to share their discoveries. The search for alternative protein sources led to increasingly desperate measures as traditional food supplies disappeared. Horses were the first alternative protein source, and initially their meat was reserved for officers and essential personnel, but as conditions worsened, horse meat became available to common soldiers as well. The taste of horse meat was described as similar to beef but tougher and with a slightly sweet flavor that many soldiers found unpleasant. However, hunger quickly overcame any objections to the taste, and horse meat became a prized delicacy that soldiers would fight over when available. The problem with horse meat was that horses were also essential for transportation and artillery movement, so eating them created additional logistical problems as the army's mobility decreased with every horse that was slaughtered. As horses became scarce, soldiers turned to other animals, including dogs, cats, and eventually rats and mice that could be caught around campsites. These smaller animals provided very little meat, but they were better than nothing, and some soldiers became expert at trapping and preparing them. The psychological barrier against eating these animals was quickly overcome by hunger, but the nutritional value was minimal, and the energy required to catch and prepare them often exceeded the calories they provided. When even small animals became scarce, soldiers began eating anything that was remotely organic, including grass, roots, tree bark, and eventually leather goods that could be boiled into a gelatinous substance that resembled food. The preparation of leather for eating required hours of boiling to break down the tough fibers and remove the chemical treatments that had been used in the tanning process. Even then, leather provided minimal nutrition while requiring significant amounts of fuel and time to prepare properly. Many soldiers became sick from eating improperly prepared leather or leather that had been treated with toxic chemicals, but hunger drove them to take these risks anyway. The psychological impact of these alternative food sources cannot be overstated, as soldiers found themselves eating things that they would never have considered food under normal circumstances. The breakdown of normal eating patterns and social taboos around food consumption contributed to the overall collapse of military discipline and social order within the army. Some soldiers adapted to these extreme conditions better than others, with rural soldiers often having more success at finding alternative food sources than their urban counterparts who lacked experience with hunting, foraging, and food preparation under primitive conditions. The skills required for survival in these conditions were very different from traditional military training, and many otherwise excellent soldiers died simply because they couldn't adapt to the new requirements for finding and preparing food. The development of survival skills often came at the cost of military effectiveness, as soldiers spent more and more time searching for food and less time maintaining their equipment, training, or following orders. The army gradually transformed from a disciplined military force into a collection of individual survivors, each focused primarily on their own immediate needs rather than larger strategic objectives. This transformation was irreversible, and even when food supplies occasionally improved, the army never regained its original cohesion and fighting effectiveness because too many soldiers had learned to prioritize personal survival over military duty. The process of finding and preparing alternative foods also created new forms of social organization within the army, as soldiers formed small groups based on survival skills rather than official military hierarchy. These informal groups often proved more effective at keeping their members alive than formal military units, but they also contributed to the breakdown of overall command structure as soldiers became loyal to their survival groups rather than to their officers or the larger mission. The cooking methods that evolved during the campaign represented a masterclass in desperate improvisation, as soldiers learned to create heat and prepare food under impossible conditions. When firewood became scarce, soldiers burned everything imaginable, including furniture torn from abandoned buildings, broken wagon wheels, clothing, leather goods, and eventually even paper and cloth items that provided only momentary heat. The most successful cooking operations used reflective surfaces like metal plates or polished wood to concentrate and direct heat, making the most efficient use of limited fuel. Some soldiers became expert at building small, efficient fires that used minimal fuel while providing maximum heat for cooking, but these skills were jealously guarded and often led to conflicts when others demanded to share the limited fuel resources. The preparation of food without proper cooking equipment led to innovations that would have been unthinkable under normal circumstances. Soldiers learned to cook meat by wrapping it in cloth and burying it near fires, using the radiant heat to slowly cook the food without requiring direct flame contact. They developed techniques for creating steam by placing wet cloth over hot stones, allowing them to cook vegetables and meat with minimal fuel consumption. Some units created communal cooking arrangements where multiple soldiers would contribute fuel and ingredients to create larger meals that could feed more people efficiently, but these arrangements often broke down when some members failed to contribute their fair share or when food became too scarce to share. The social dynamics around food preparation became increasingly complex, as soldiers developed elaborate systems for determining who would cook, who would contribute ingredients, and how the finished food would be distributed. These systems often reflected the unofficial hierarchy that had developed within survival groups, with the most skilled foragers and cooks gaining positions of leadership and authority that superseded official military rank. The role of cook became one of the most important and dangerous positions within these groups, as cooks had access to food and the knowledge of how to prepare it, but they also became targets for robbery and violence from desperate soldiers who wanted to control the food supply. The development of food preservation techniques under field conditions represented another area of desperate innovation, as soldiers learned to make the most of whatever food they could find. Smoking meat over small fires became a common practice when soldiers could find enough fuel and when they had time to tend the fires for the hours required to properly preserve meat. Some soldiers became expert at creating makeshift smokehouses using cloth, tent material, and wooden frames, but these operations were vulnerable to attack and discovery by enemy forces or competing groups of soldiers. The preservation of vegetables and other perishable foods required different techniques, including fermentation processes that could be carried out without specialized equipment. Some soldiers learned to create sauerkraut-like preserves using whatever vegetables they could find, but these processes required time, salt, and containers that were often not available. The creation of pemmican, a concentrated mixture of dried meat, fat, and sometimes berries, became another survival technique borrowed from indigenous peoples, but the ingredients required for proper pemmican were almost never available in sufficient quantities. The storage of food became a constant challenge, as soldiers had to balance the need to preserve what little food they had against the risk of having it stolen by other soldiers. Many developed elaborate hiding techniques for concealing food, including sewing it into clothing, hiding it in false bottoms of containers, and even burying it along the route of march with the hope of retrieving it later. Some soldiers became expert at creating decoy food caches that would satisfy thieves while protecting their real food supplies, but these techniques required time, energy, and materials that were often in short supply. The psychological stress of constantly protecting food supplies from theft created an atmosphere of paranoia and distrust that poisoned relationships between soldiers even within the same units. Men who had been friends and comrades for years became suspicious of each other when food was involved, and many friendships were destroyed by accusations of theft or hoarding. The impact of malnutrition on cognitive function became increasingly apparent as the campaign progressed, with soldiers making increasingly poor decisions about food procurement, preparation, and consumption. Starving soldiers often made dangerous choices like eating unknown plants, consuming spoiled meat, or drinking contaminated water because their judgment was impaired by hunger and nutrient deficiency. The inability to think clearly about food choices created a vicious cycle where poor decisions led to illness and weakness, which in turn led to even poorer decisions about food. The medical understanding of nutrition in 1812 was primitive compared to modern knowledge, but French military doctors were sophisticated enough to recognize the connection between diet and health. They documented the progression of various nutritional deficiency diseases, including scurvy, which caused bleeding gums, loose teeth, and weakness, and pellagra, which caused skin lesions, mental confusion, and digestive problems. However, their understanding of vitamins and minerals was limited, and they had no effective treatments for most nutritional deficiency diseases beyond recommending foods that were not available. The doctors also observed the psychological effects of starvation, including hallucinations, depression, and aggressive behavior, but they had no framework for understanding these symptoms as medical rather than disciplinary problems. Some medical officers attempted to create supplemental nutrition using whatever materials were available, including boiling bones to extract calcium and other minerals and creating broths from grass and tree bark that might provide minimal vitamins, but these efforts were largely ineffective and sometimes dangerous. The role of alcohol in the Army's nutrition became increasingly important as other food sources disappeared. Alcohol provided calories and could help soldiers cope with hunger and cold, but it also impaired judgment and increased the risk of hypothermia and accidents. The wine and brandy that were part of the official rations were consumed quickly, and soldiers turned to any available alcohol, including industrial spirits, medical alcohol, and even alcohol-based cleaning products that could cause blindness or death. Some soldiers learned to ferment whatever plant materials they could find to create crude alcoholic beverages, but these were often contaminated with dangerous bacteria or other toxins. The use of alcohol as a food substitute created additional health problems, as soldiers who relied heavily on alcohol for calories developed symptoms of alcoholism and liver damage that further weakened their ability to survive the harsh conditions. The barter and trade systems that developed around food created a complex underground economy within the Army, where everything from buttons and equipment to sexual favors and personal services could be exchanged for food. Items that had value in normal circumstances became worthless, while things that could be eaten or used to obtain food became incredibly valuable. A single hard biscuit could be worth more than a gold coin, and soldiers would trade family heirlooms, weapons, and even their clothes for small amounts of food. The exchange rates in this economy were constantly fluctuating based on supply and demand, with prices rising dramatically during periods when no food was available and falling when occasional foraging expeditions were successful. Some soldiers became expert traders, learning to identify items that other soldiers might want and building networks of contacts who could provide access to food or information about where food might be found. These trading networks often crossed unit boundaries and even national lines, as soldiers were willing to trade with anyone who might have access to food, regardless of their official allegiances. The development of these trading relationships sometimes provided soldiers with access to food sources that would have been impossible to obtain through official channels, but they also created new forms of dependence and vulnerability, as soldiers became reliant on trading partners who might disappear or be killed at any time. The seasonal changes in available food sources created additional challenges as the campaign progressed through different parts of the year. The summer months had provided some access to wild berries, nuts, and other forageable foods, but these disappeared as autumn progressed into winter, leaving soldiers with even fewer options for supplementing their non-existent rations. The timing of the harvest season meant that the army missed most opportunities to benefit from agricultural production in the regions they passed through, as crops had either been harvested and hidden by local populations or destroyed as part of the scorched earth policy. Winter conditions made foraging much more difficult, as edible plants died back, underground sources of food froze solid, and animal behavior changed, making hunting and trapping much less successful. Some soldiers attempted to preserve foods from the summer and autumn months, but the lack of proper preservation equipment and techniques meant that most of these efforts failed, leaving soldiers with spoiled food that could make them sick. The psychological impact of seasonal food scarcity was particularly devastating, as soldiers realized that conditions would continue to worsen throughout the winter months with no prospect of improvement until the following spring. The knowledge that they were heading into the worst period for food availability while already starving created a sense of hopelessness that contributed to the breakdown of morale and discipline. The relationship between food and military effectiveness became increasingly apparent, as units that had better access to food maintained their fighting capability longer than those that were completely starving. However, even well-fed units, by the standards of the campaign, were operating at a fraction of their normal effectiveness due to the overall shortage of supplies. The ability to fight effectively required not just calories but also specific nutrients that were almost completely absent from the army's diet by the later stages of the campaign. Soldiers who were deficient in iron developed anemia that made them weak and easily exhausted, while those lacking in vitamin C developed scurvy that made their gums bleed and their teeth fall out. These medical conditions made it difficult or impossible for soldiers to perform basic military functions like marching, loading weapons, or following complex orders. The connection between nutrition and morale was also clearly evident, as soldiers who had access to even small amounts of food were more likely to maintain their discipline and follow orders than those who were completely starving. The simple act of eating something, even if it was tree bark or leather, seemed to provide psychological benefits that went beyond the minimal nutritional value of these substances. Some commanders recognized this connection and made extraordinary efforts to ensure that their soldiers had access to at least token amounts of food, even when official rations were completely exhausted. The symbolic importance of food became almost as important as its nutritional value, as soldiers needed to believe that they were still being cared for by their leadership, even when the reality was that no one could provide adequate nutrition. The communication systems that developed around food information became critical for survival, as soldiers who had access to information about where food might be found had significant advantages over those who were operating in isolation. Word-of-mouth networks spread information about successful foraging locations, sources of edible plants, and opportunities for trade or theft, but this information was often jealously guarded and sometimes deliberately falsified to mislead competitors. Some soldiers became expert at gathering and evaluating food-related intelligence, learning to distinguish between reliable and unreliable sources of information and developing networks of contacts who could provide accurate updates about food availability. These intelligence networks often proved more valuable than official military communications, as they provided information that was directly relevant to immediate survival needs rather than strategic military objectives. The development of specialized roles within survival groups reflected the complexity of obtaining and preparing food under extreme conditions. Some soldiers became expert foragers who could identify edible plants and locate hidden food sources, while others specialized in hunting and trapping small animals. Still others became expert cooks who could make the most of whatever ingredients were available, or traders who could exchange non-food items for edible supplies. These specialized roles created interdependencies within groups that could provide security and efficiency, but also created vulnerabilities when key individuals were killed, injured, or decided to leave the group. The loss of a skilled forager or cook could be devastating for a survival group, as their specialized knowledge was often difficult to replace quickly enough to prevent starvation. The teaching and learning of survival skills became a critical activity, as soldiers who had developed successful techniques for finding and preparing food tried to pass on their knowledge to others. However, the competitive nature of food procurement meant that some soldiers were reluctant to share their knowledge, as doing so could create additional competition for limited resources. The decision of whether to teach survival skills to others became a complex calculation involving considerations of group loyalty, personal security, and the availability of food resources. Some soldiers developed elaborate teaching systems that allowed them to share some knowledge while retaining the most valuable information for themselves. The preservation of institutional knowledge about food procurement became a challenge, as soldiers who developed successful techniques were often killed before they could pass on their knowledge to others. The high mortality rate among the most successful foragers and hunters meant that valuable survival techniques were constantly being lost, requiring other soldiers to rediscover techniques that had already been developed by soldiers who had died. The lack of written records about food procurement techniques meant that knowledge transfer was entirely dependent on personal relationships and direct instruction, which made it vulnerable to disruption by death, injury, or separation. The long-term health consequences of the extreme malnutrition experienced during the Russian campaign affected survivors for the rest of their lives. Many developed chronic digestive problems, as their gastrointestinal systems never fully recovered from the damage caused by eating inappropriate foods and experiencing prolonged starvation. Some suffered from permanent dental problems as a result of nutritional deficiencies that affected tooth and bone development, while others experienced ongoing issues with nutrient absorption that made it difficult for them to maintain proper nutrition even when adequate food was available. The psychological effects of the food crisis lasted even longer than the physical effects, as survivors developed eating disorders and food anxieties that influenced their behavior for decades after the campaign. Many became compulsive hoarders who stockpiled food far beyond any reasonable need, while others developed rituals around eating that reflected their traumatic experiences with starvation. Some survivors found it impossible to enjoy meals, as they were constantly reminded of comrades who had died of hunger, while others became obsessive about food preparation and preservation as a way of exerting control over their environment. The social impact of the food crisis extended beyond individual survivors to affect families and communities throughout France, as the stories of starvation and cannibalism became part of the collective memory of the campaign. These stories influenced French attitudes toward military service and warfare, as the population realized that even the most powerful army could be reduced to starvation under the right circumstances. The knowledge that French soldiers had been forced to eat leather and human flesh became a source of national shame that influenced French military and political decisions for generations. The campaign also affected European attitudes toward Russia and winter warfare, as other nations learned from the French example that traditional military strategies were inadequate for dealing with the combination of hostile climate and scorched earth tactics. The Russian model of using food scarcity as a weapon influenced military planning throughout Europe, as armies began to invest much more heavily in logistics and supply chain management while also developing contingency plans for operating under extreme food scarcity. The technological innovations that emerged from the food crisis during the Russian campaign had lasting impacts on military science and civilian food production. French engineers who survived the campaign brought back knowledge about emergency food preparation techniques that influenced the development of preserved foods for both military and civilian use. The lessons learned about the importance of portable nutrition led to advances in food preservation, chemistry, and packaging that benefited society long after the military applications were forgotten. Some of the survival techniques developed by soldiers during the campaign were later studied and refined by food scientists who recognized their potential value for addressing civilian food shortages during natural disasters or economic crises. The specific foods that soldiers learned to identify and prepare in Russia became part of European knowledge about emergency nutrition, with some plants and preparation methods entering civilian cookbooks as curiosities or emergency preparations. The cultural transmission of food knowledge from the Russian campaign created unexpected connections between military history and civilian food culture, as recipes and techniques developed under extreme conditions found their way into normal cooking practices. Some of the fermentation and preservation techniques that soldiers developed out of desperation were later refined and commercialized, becoming standard methods for preserving food in areas where refrigeration was not available. The international dimension of the food crisis became apparent when survivors from different nations shared their experiences and compared the different approaches their armies had taken to dealing with starvation. Soldiers from different countries had developed different survival strategies based on their cultural backgrounds and previous experiences with food scarcity. German soldiers often had better knowledge of identifying edible plants due to their rural backgrounds, while Italian soldiers were more skilled at improvising cooking techniques that could make unpalatable ingredients more edible. Polish soldiers brought knowledge of winter survival techniques that had been developed in their homeland, while Austrian soldiers contributed expertise in food preservation methods that had been developed in their mountainous regions. The exchange of survival knowledge between soldiers from different countries created a sort of international database of emergency food techniques that would not have existed without the shared crisis of the Russian campaign. Some of the most effective survival strategies emerged from this cross-cultural exchange, as soldiers learned techniques from their allies that they would never have discovered on their own. The religious and philosophical implications of the food crisis challenged many soldiers' fundamental beliefs about civilization, morality, and human nature. Soldiers who had been raised in Christian societies found themselves violating basic religious prohibitions against cannibalism and theft as survival instincts overrode moral teachings. The theological questions raised by the food crisis created lasting spiritual crises for many survivors who struggled to reconcile their actions during the campaign with their religious beliefs. Some soldiers lost their faith entirely, as they concluded that a benevolent God would not have allowed such suffering, while others developed more complex theological frameworks that could accommodate the moral compromises they had been forced to make. The philosophical impact of the food crisis extended beyond religious questions to challenge Enlightenment beliefs about human nature and the progress of civilization. Soldiers who had believed in the fundamental goodness of humanity found themselves confronting evidence that people would commit horrific acts when reduced to starvation. The experience of the Russian campaign influenced European philosophical thought about the relationship between civilization and barbarism, as intellectuals grappled with the implications of how quickly civilized soldiers had reverted to primitive survival behaviors. Some philosophers used the Russian campaign as evidence for their theories about the thin veneer of civilization, while others argued that the extreme conditions invalidated any conclusions about normal human behavior. The economic impact of the food crisis extended far beyond the immediate military costs, as the loss of so many soldiers created labor shortages throughout the French Empire that affected agricultural production for years after the campaign. The soldiers who died in Russia represented a significant portion of France's young male population, and their deaths created demographic imbalances that influenced French society for decades. Many of the soldiers who died had been farmers and agricultural workers whose knowledge and labor were essential for food production in France, and the loss of this expertise contributed to reduced agricultural yields and food shortages in subsequent years. The economic cost of feeding and supplying the Russian campaign also created financial pressures that influenced French domestic policy and international relations for years after the military defeat. Napoleon's government had borrowed heavily to finance the campaign, and the failure to achieve the expected quick victory meant that these debts could not be repaid through conquest and plunder as had been the pattern in previous campaigns. The financial crisis created by the failed campaign contributed to political instability within France, as different groups competed for control over the reduced resources available to the government. The international trade implications of the Russian campaign were also significant, as the demonstration of French military vulnerability encouraged other nations to challenge French economic dominance and seek alternative trading relationships. The technological development of emergency rations accelerated dramatically after the Russian campaign, as military planners throughout Europe recognized the need for more reliable and nutritious portable foods. The traditional reliance on hardtack and salt pork was supplemented by new types of preserved foods that could provide better nutrition in smaller packages. French food scientists worked to develop concentrated foods that could provide maximum nutrition per ounce of weight while also being resistant to spoilage under extreme conditions. Some of these developments led to the creation of early forms of canned foods and other preservation techniques that would later become standard in both military and civilian contexts. The research into emergency nutrition that began as a response to the Russian campaign contributed to broader advances in food science and nutrition that benefited civilian populations throughout Europe. The development of more effective cooking equipment for military use also emerged from the lessons of the Russian campaign, as engineers recognized the need for portable stoves and cooking implements that could function under extreme conditions. These technological developments had applications beyond military use, as they contributed to improvements in camping equipment and outdoor cooking gear that benefited civilian activities like exploration, scientific expeditions, and eventually recreational camping. The medical research that emerged from studying the effects of starvation during the Russian campaign advanced European understanding of nutrition and metabolism in ways that had lasting benefits for civilian medicine. French military doctors who survived the campaign brought back detailed observations about the progression of starvation and nutritional deficiency diseases that contributed to the development of more effective treatments for these conditions. The documentation of the psychological effects of extreme hunger contributed to early understanding of the relationship between nutrition and mental health, which influenced the development of treatments for various psychiatric conditions. Some of the medical techniques developed for treating starvation and malnutrition during the Russian campaign were later applied to civilian populations during famines and other food crises throughout Europe. The educational impact of the Russian campaign influenced military training throughout Europe, as armies began to include survival skills and emergency food procurement in their standard training programs. Soldiers were taught to identify edible plants, prepare alternative foods, and preserve whatever food they could find under field conditions. These survival skills became standard parts of military training and eventually influenced civilian education as well, with some schools beginning to teach basic survival techniques as part of their curriculum. The knowledge about emergency food preparation that emerged from the Russian campaign was eventually incorporated into civilian disaster preparedness programs and emergency response protocols that helped communities deal with natural disasters and other crises. The literary and artistic impact of the food crisis during the Russian campaign influenced European culture for generations, as writers, artists, and musicians used the experience of starvation as a theme in their works. The image of Napoleon's starving soldiers became a powerful symbol in European art and literature, representing the costs of war and the fragility of human civilization. Some of the most famous works of 19th-century European literature drew inspiration from accounts of the Russian campaign, using the experience of extreme hunger as a metaphor for various aspects of the human condition. The artistic representation of the food crisis helped to preserve the memory of the campaign in popular culture, ensuring that the lessons learned about the importance of logistics and supply would not be forgotten by future generations. The scientific study of nutrition and food science was revolutionized by the need to understand what had gone wrong during the Russian campaign and how similar disasters could be prevented in the future. European universities began to establish formal programs for studying nutrition and food preservation as academic disciplines rather than purely practical skills. The research methods developed for studying the effects of starvation during the Russian campaign contributed to the development of modern nutritional science and established methodologies for studying the relationship between diet and health that are still used today. Some of the most important early discoveries about vitamins, minerals, and other essential nutrients emerged from research that was originally motivated by the need to understand the medical problems that had affected Napoleon's army. The establishment of formal logistics as a military science can be traced directly to the lessons learned from the Russian campaign, as European armies recognized that supply chain management was just as important as tactics and strategy for military success. Military academies throughout Europe began to offer formal training in logistics and supply chain management, while also developing mathematical models for calculating the food and supply requirements for different types of military operations. The professionalization of military logistics created new career paths for officers who specialized in supply management and established logistics as a legitimate field of military expertise rather than a secondary concern. The influence of the Russian campaign on the development of modern logistics extended beyond military applications to influence civilian supply chain management and the development of modern transportation and distribution systems. The demographic impact of the Russian campaign created lasting changes in European population patterns, as the loss of so many young men from France and its allied territories created imbalances that influenced marriage patterns, birth rates, and social structures for decades. The regions that had contributed the most soldiers to the Russian campaign experienced the most severe demographic disruptions, with some areas losing entire generations of young men, which affected local economies and social structures. Some communities never fully recovered from the population losses suffered during the Russian campaign, and the demographic effects of the campaign contributed to regional population decline that lasted well into the 19th century. The social changes that resulted from these demographic disruptions influenced European society in ways that extended far beyond the immediate military and political consequences of the campaign. The international diplomatic implications of the food crisis during the Russian campaign influenced European politics for decades, as the demonstration of French vulnerability encouraged the formation of new coalitions and alliances directed against French power. The knowledge that even the most powerful army could be defeated through logistical warfare rather than direct military confrontation changed the strategic calculations of European powers and influenced the development of new forms of economic and diplomatic warfare. Some nations began to develop strategies for using economic pressure and supply disruption as alternatives to direct military confrontation, recognizing that these methods could be more effective and less costly than traditional warfare. The Russian model of scorched earth tactics combined with winter warfare became a template that was studied and adapted by other nations facing invasion by more powerful enemies. The technological and scientific advances that emerged from studying the Russian campaign had applications far beyond military affairs, as the research into nutrition, preservation techniques, and emergency food production contributed to improvements in civilian food security and public health. European governments began to invest more heavily in agricultural research and food security programs, recognizing that reliable food supplies were essential for political stability and national security. The development of better food preservation and distribution systems helped to reduce the severity and frequency of famines throughout Europe, while also improving the overall nutritional status of civilian populations. Some of the emergency food techniques developed during the Russian campaign were later adapted for use in hospitals, prisons, and other institutions where providing adequate nutrition under difficult conditions was a constant challenge. The psychological and medical understanding of the effects of extreme stress and starvation that emerged from studying the Russian campaign contributed to early developments in trauma medicine and psychiatric care. European doctors began to recognize that extreme experiences like those suffered during the Russian campaign could have lasting psychological effects that required medical treatment rather than moral judgment. The research into the psychological effects of starvation contributed to better understanding of eating disorders and other mental health conditions that were related to food and nutrition. The medical documentation of the Russian campaign provided some of the earliest systematic studies of human behavior under extreme stress, which influenced the development of psychology and psychiatry as scientific disciplines. The educational and training implications of the Russian campaign influenced European military and civilian education for generations, as the need for better preparation for extreme conditions became apparent. Military training programs began to include more extensive survival skills, while civilian education began to incorporate basic emergency preparedness and food security knowledge. Some of the survival techniques that had been developed during the Russian campaign were formalized into training programs that were used by explorers, scientists, and other civilians who might face extreme conditions in their work. The emphasis on practical skills and emergency preparedness that emerged from the Russian campaign influenced educational philosophy throughout Europe, as educators recognized the importance of preparing students for real-world challenges rather than purely academic knowledge. The legacy of Napoleon's starving army in Russia thus extended far beyond the immediate military disaster to influence European civilization in fundamental ways that lasted well into the modern era. The food crisis that destroyed the Grande Armée became a catalyst for advances in science, technology, medicine, and social organization that helped to shape the modern world in ways that the starving soldiers of 1812 could never have imagined. The survivors who made it back to France carried more than just physical and psychological scars. They carried knowledge that would transform how Europe thought about war, logistics, and human survival under extreme conditions. The techniques they had developed for finding, preparing, and preserving food under impossible circumstances became the foundation for modern emergency preparedness and disaster response protocols. Military academies throughout Europe began incorporating survival training into their curricula, teaching officers not just how to win battles but how to keep their men alive when traditional supply lines failed. The agricultural innovations that emerged from studying the Russian campaign had profound effects on European food production. Farmers began experimenting with cold-resistant crops and preservation techniques that had been developed by desperate soldiers. The understanding of nutrition that emerged from medical studies of starvation survivors led to improvements in both military and civilian diets. Food scientists began developing concentrated nutrition sources that could sustain people during emergencies, laying the groundwork for modern emergency rations and food aid programs. The psychological studies of starvation survivors contributed to the early development of what would eventually become trauma psychology and post-traumatic stress disorder treatment. European physicians began to understand that extreme experiences could cause lasting mental health problems that required medical intervention rather than moral judgment. The documentation of how hunger affected decision-making and social behavior influenced early research into the relationship between physical deprivation and mental function. The economic lessons of the Russian campaign influenced European trade policy and agricultural development for generations. Governments began investing more heavily in domestic food production and strategic food reserves, recognizing that food security was essential for national security. The understanding that armies could be defeated through logistics rather than direct combat changed military strategy throughout Europe, with nations developing more sophisticated supply chain management and contingency planning for extended campaigns. The technological innovations that emerged from the desperate improvisation of Napoleon's soldiers influenced developments in cooking equipment, food preservation, and emergency shelter construction. The portable cooking methods developed by starving soldiers were refined and commercialized, becoming standard equipment for explorers, military forces, and eventually civilian camping enthusiasts. The preservation techniques developed under extreme conditions contributed to advances in food science that benefited civilian populations dealing with food scarcity. The demographic impact of the campaign created lasting changes in European society as entire communities struggled to recover from the loss of their young men. Villages throughout France and Allied territories found themselves without farmers, craftsmen, and laborers, leading to economic disruption that lasted for decades. The social changes that resulted from these population losses contributed to political instability and social reform movements throughout Europe. The international implications of the Russian campaign extended far beyond the immediate military consequences, as other European powers learned valuable lessons about the importance of logistics, the effectiveness of defensive strategies, and the vulnerability of even the most powerful armies. The Russian model of using winter weather and scorched earth tactics as weapons became a template that was studied and adapted by military planners throughout Europe and beyond. The cultural impact of the campaign influenced European literature, art, and popular culture for generations. The image of Napoleon's starving soldiers became a powerful symbol of human suffering and the costs of war, appearing in countless works of fiction, poetry, and visual art. The stories of survival and endurance that emerged from the campaign became part of European folklore, teaching lessons about human resilience and the importance of preparation for extreme conditions. The scientific advances that emerged from studying the Russian campaign contributed to the development of modern nutritional science, food preservation technology, and emergency medicine. Research into the effects of starvation led to better understanding of human metabolism, nutritional requirements, and the relationship between diet and health. These discoveries had applications far beyond military medicine, contributing to improvements in public health and the treatment of malnutrition throughout Europe. The educational reforms that followed the Russian campaign influenced both military and civilian training programs, as educators recognized the need to prepare people for extreme conditions and emergency situations. Survival skills that had been developed by desperate soldiers were formalized into training curricula, while emergency preparedness became a standard part of both military and civilian education. The legacy of Napoleon's Russian campaign thus represents one of history's most complete examples of how military disaster can become a catalyst for social, technological, and scientific progress. The suffering of those 600,000 soldiers was not in vain if it contributed to knowledge and innovations that helped prevent similar disasters in the future and improved the lives of countless people throughout Europe and beyond. The transformation of military logistics that resulted from the Russian campaign established principles that remain relevant today. Modern armies still study the campaign as an example of how logistical failure can defeat even the most powerful military forces, and the lessons learned about supply chain management continue to influence military planning in the modern era. The understanding that armies march on their stomachs became more than just a saying, it became a fundamental principle of military science that influenced the development of modern military doctrine. The humanitarian implications of the Russian campaign also contributed to the development of international laws governing the treatment of prisoners of war and civilian populations during military campaigns. The stories of starvation and suffering that emerged from the campaign influenced early discussions about the laws of war and the responsibilities of military commanders toward both their own soldiers and enemy civilians. The environmental lessons of the Russian campaign, particularly the effectiveness of using climate and geography as defensive weapons, influenced military strategy and environmental policy throughout Europe. Military planners began to pay more attention to environmental factors in their strategic planning, while governments began to consider how natural resources and climate could be used for defensive purposes. The technological innovations that emerged from the desperate improvisation of Napoleon's soldiers laid the groundwork for many modern survival technologies. The cooking methods, shelter construction techniques, and food preservation strategies developed by starving soldiers were refined and improved over the centuries, eventually becoming standard components of modern emergency preparedness and disaster response protocols. The medical knowledge gained from studying starvation survivors contributed to advances in emergency medicine, nutrition science, and psychological treatment that benefited civilian populations throughout Europe. The understanding of how the human body responds to extreme stress and deprivation informed the development of treatments for various medical conditions and contributed to improvements in public health policy. The social changes that resulted from the demographic impact of the Russian campaign influenced European society for generations, contributing to changes in marriage patterns, family structures, and economic organization. The loss of so many young men created opportunities for social mobility and economic change that might not have occurred under normal circumstances, while also creating challenges that required innovative solutions. The political implications of the Russian campaign extended far beyond the immediate military consequences, influencing the development of modern European politics and international relations. The demonstration that even the most powerful empires could be vulnerable to logistical warfare changed how nations approached international relations and military planning, contributing to the development of more sophisticated diplomatic and military strategies. The cultural transmission of knowledge from the Russian campaign created lasting connections between military history and civilian life, as survival techniques developed by desperate soldiers found their way into mainstream culture. The recipes, preservation methods, and emergency techniques that had been developed under extreme conditions became part of European folk knowledge, passing from generation to generation and contributing to the overall resilience of civilian populations. So when we remember Napoleon's Grande Armée and their terrible journey through Russia, we should remember not just the suffering and death, but also the knowledge and innovations that emerged from that suffering. The starving soldiers who gnawed on leather boots and fought over scraps of bread contributed, through their desperate improvisation and hard-won knowledge, to advances in science, technology, and human understanding that benefited countless people in the generations that followed. The legacy of those 600,000 men who marched into Russia lives on in every emergency ration, every survival manual, every disaster preparedness protocol, and every advance in nutritional science that helps people survive extreme conditions. Their suffering was not meaningless if it contributed to knowledge that prevents similar disasters and saves lives in the future. And perhaps that's the most important lesson of all from Napoleon's Russian campaign, that even in the darkest moments of human history, when civilization breaks down and people are reduced to their most basic survival instincts, knowledge and innovation can emerge that helps build a better future. The soldiers who died of starvation in the Russian snow could never have imagined that their desperate attempts to survive would contribute to advances in science and technology that would benefit humanity for generations to come. In the end, Napoleon's Russian campaign stands as a testament to both human vulnerability and human resilience, showing us how quickly the veneer of civilization can disappear when basic needs are not met, but also how human ingenuity and the will to survive can create knowledge and innovations that last long after the immediate crisis has passed. The hungry soldiers of the Grande Army taught us that armies do indeed march on their stomachs, but they also taught us that human beings can endure incredible hardship and still find ways to help those who come after them.